Our seminar today. It is my pleasure. Sorry.
So, can I just make a quick announcement? And let me hit record here real quick first.
You are recording. Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Sorry, we had some Zoom technical issues. Zoom account has been hacked,
So I will be deleting that
personal meeting room. So sorry, that was really inappropriate and shocking. But thank you all for moving over to this new Zoom.
link. Jake's laughing.
You didn't see it, or you didn't want to see it. You're glad. But we'll turn it over. We'll get started with our distinguished guest speaker. So sorry for the delay.
No problem. Welcome, guys. Thank you for coming to our weekly seminar meeting, and thank you for the pizza provided. My name is Taylor, and it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Jeremy Pittman. He is an associate professor at the University of Waterloo's School of Planning in Waterloo, Ontario. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Regina in Saskatchewan, both in geography, and his PhD from the University of Waterloo in social and ecological sustainability. His current research is focused on environmental governance and policy, specifically working on sustainability-oriented projects with a diverse range of communities and sectors, both in Canada and internationally. Before joining the University of Waterloo faculty, Dr. Pittman worked for the private sector in both provincial and federal governments in Canada on issues relating to the resilience of rural, agricultural, and fisheries-based communities experiencing social and ecological change. Dr. Pittman's research interests include environmental policy and governance in the Anthropocene, landscape and seascape scale approaches to planning, human communities in our increasingly interconnected world, and social ecological systems. Dr. Pittman has 23 peer-reviewed publications as of 2017, with topics ranging from adaptive management to social ecological connections to traditional ecological knowledge, and has been the recipient of numerous prestigious awards and fellowships, most notably the Lieber Era Fellowship for Young Conservation Scientists in Canada. A fun fact about Jeremy is that he and Drew first met during a diaper run at a Target, and that was 6 years ago, and they continue to work in a scholarly setting today. I'm stoked to hear his presentation today on the social fit of conservation policy on working landscapes. And please join me in giving him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Drew and Ethel, for being here today. As Taylor was saying, I'm Jeremy Pittman. I'm an associate professor in University of Waterloo. I look at, as Taylor was saying, I look at social ecological systems and whatnot. Done so kind of a lot of different systems. Stuff that I'm most excited about is something I'm going to be presenting to you here today. Because it's kind of based on where I'm from. I grew up kind of just straight north of here in Saskatchewan on working landscapes and that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I'm happy to talk with you here about that today. The title of my talk for today is going to be the social fit of conservation policy on working landscapes. Yeah, so I'm a little bit more of a social scientist, but I kind of dabble in interdisciplinary work. But yeah, so a lot of what I focus on is this idea of like how do we actually fit institutions to the local context, help achieve our different goals that we have for these, whether it's conservation or otherwise, while maintaining livelihoods and that kind of thing. So I'll get into that a little bit more. Next slide. So usually on working landscapes, what we're doing from a policy perspective, we're trying to find these solutions to a broad range of sustainability challenges. Right now, probably the biggest ones are things like, protecting the grasslands, stewarding the grasslands so they can support species at risk, which in Canada we call species at risk, down here I think we call them endangered species, that kind of thing. We also want to make sure that grasslands can store carbon, sequester carbon in certain cases, all these kind of things. But these grasslands are also supporting a lot of livelihoods in local communities, and so we need to take that into account as well. Maybe next slide. Yeah, and so typically what we're doing when we're designing conservation programs, we have some kind of goal in mind related to conservation and whatnot. We developed a conservation program, which the way that we kind of articulated that or defined it for this work, it involves both an instrument and an incentive. Kind of in a really broad sense, an instrument is kind of what you want to do. Do you want to buy land? Do you want to kind of incentivize people? That kind of thing. Whereas the incentives are the different sort of things that make people want to do something, the different things that motivate people in different ways. So they can be financial. A lot of them are, probably the ones that you're most familiar with are financial. They can also be sort of legal. They're kind of a broad range of incentives that are out there. So we're kind of developing these programs. Those are kind of the two key ingredients. There's a lot more. It's kind of a simplistic view, right? Those are kind of two of the main pieces though that you have to know. One of the things that kind of moderates the success of your program, though, so you design this program to try to achieve these goals. One of the things that really moderates the success of your program is how much do people actually want to do this, right? Is this kind of like really an affront to them, and that kind of thing? How much is what you're kind of doing aligned with their values? If you can imagine on working landscapes where, upwards of 90% of some landscapes are privately owned, this becomes even more important, right? It's hard to get traction to reach your goals if you're not sort of aligning with people's values. That's kind of the overarching thing, I guess. So this is kind of a little bit, some theoretic work about socio-ecological fit or social fit in this case, I guess. So, brief background, institutional fit kind of comes out of the institutions and environmental change scholarship. Warren Young was really big in it. Carl Folke, those types of scholars have really been talking about this for a long time. There's sort of two components of fit more broadly. One is ecological. That's like how do the institutions actually fit the ecosystem, that part of it. But the part I'm going to talk to you today a little bit more about is what we call social fit, or essentially how does the policy or program align with people's values in sort of a simplistic way? How much is this sort of something that they want to do, that kind of thing. Yeah, just kind of describe this a little bit more in detail. So you have, this governance system, that's kind of where you have these policies and these instruments and incentives, that kind of stuff. You have community values, which for the purposes of this work, we've kind of articulated it as preferences group policy instruments and incentives. Those kind of interact to create social fit. And the idea is like, you get the social fit right, you're going to achieve or help achieve your social and ecological outcomes. So obviously a lot more pieces of the puzzle than that, right? This is kind of the piece that we focused in for this work. I can probably just kind of quickly. Yeah, so what I'm going to be talking to you about today is sort of the overarching research question. It's kind of getting at that piece of that second box up here, but what instruments and incentives do people actually want on a landscape? And to do this, we did some online surveys with landowners. It's a bit of a convenience sample for this, right? They're kind of broad and exploratory, but hadn't been a lot of work done on this before. So, we're just trying to get out there to as many people as possible at the time. But essentially what we did online surveys with landowners. We had about 231 completes. It's kind of roughly broke down. There's a few in British Columbia, about 10 British Columbia. It's only a small part of British Columbia that we targeted. There's only a small part that has kind of rangelands in that area. About 49 from Alberta, which is right there, kind of the southern part of Alberta. That's where the rangelands are. 64 from Saskatchewan, and 22 from Manitoba, where the rangelands are kind of in the southeast corner there. Also important to note, though, is there's a lot of people that didn't report. As you can imagine, sometimes talking about these things with landowners is kind of not something they want to talk about and they don't want to share a lot all the time, right? So in certain cases, they didn't even want to report what province they were from. That's totally fine. We're not able to do geographic analysis then, right? But still kind of included in the sample and whatnot. Yeah, what else should I mention here? Yeah, I think that's it. Overall, we had 231 completes. That's kind of roughly how they break down by provinces. And if you didn't know, it's kind of this part here of the country that we're targeting. Next slide. Yeah, basically through the bottom. Yeah, so in terms of instruments, we focused on 4 main types of instruments. There's a lot more out there as well, but these were 4 that were sort of top of the mind in terms of policy debates that were going on at the time. These are ones that different organizations wanted to try out, and the federal government was kind of trying to support in different ways. So the first one is conservation easements. And you're probably somewhat familiar with that, or at least heard of them, but that's where something goes on title. So when you own a piece of property, there's something that's put on title that says like you can't break this land or drain it or something like that. It's kind of on the title, it's there forever in most cases. Although temporary or term easements are becoming a little bit more popular now. I should say, like at this point in time, we were just focused on perpetual easements, right? So that's kind of what the people had in mind when they were answering their survey. There's land securement, and that's where you're actually selling the land to a land trust or something like that. In Canada, we have the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which buys a lot of land for these purposes, sort of act as a land trust. That's like where you're actually, your strategy, your instrument is like you're actually taking the land out of the ownership of rural people, right? It goes into the ownership of a conservation organization. We have conservation management agreements, which is really a broad set of almost sub-instruments in some ways, but what that refers to is, going and engaging a landowner. And if their property is really good and they've been doing lots of good stuff in the past, you might do what we call the results-based agreement. So that's where you're not super prescriptive about the practices. but you're setting the result that you want to see, and the landlord's kind of allowed to get there in any way that kind of fits their operation, right? So those are kind of work well in places where people are already kind of doing good stuff, and they already have habitat out there, that they're already, conserving things in different ways. Habitat management plan is a little bit more specific, and you still work with the landowner to produce them, but they can be a little bit more, I guess like the practices are more specific. You might get into something like grazing management and things like that, kind of formalizing it in a plan. If they follow the plan, they receive the incentive, that kind of thing. The last one we looked at was market certification. So that's where there's some sort of verifiable standard, third-party verified, that says, if they come on your operation, they say you're kind of meeting a certain standard, you get sort of, preferential access or some kind of access to a market based on that. There might be some kind of logo on the beef or whatever in the grocery store. It's that kind of thing. Excellent. Here's 5. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so in terms of the different incentives that we looked at, we've start off with legal assurances, legal protection. So that's something that's really new in the Canadian context and not really functioning actually. It's kind of similar to like the safe harbor agreements that you have down here. And there's people that are trying to model those types of agreements a little bit in Canada off of the safe harbors down here. But anyways, at this point, what we want to do is see how much people would be interested in something like that, based on their previous experiences and things like that. The second one is market-based premiums. So that's where you're actually, your incentive is that because you produce something in a sustainable way, you're able to sell it for a little bit more, that kind of thing. The third one was cost sharing. So that's where it's really practice oriented. So say you want to do a particular practice, you have to pay like a certain proportion, usually 50-50 is how it's set up. You pay 50% of the costs, the government pays the other 50%, that kind of thing. Annual payments are when there's sort of this annual per acre payment or something like that that's triggered. It aligns really well with the results-based idea, where if you keep kind of hitting this result, it triggers this payment on an annual basis. And the last one is one-time payments. So that's kind of like a lump sum. You sign up for an easement or something like that, or you sell your land, you get kind of a lump sum payment for that kind of thing. That's a different kind of incentives that we looked at. That's some of the results. Like one more example.
Keep going.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry. Yeah, so coming back to some of these questions, so we want to look at what factors are most important when people are considering participating in these programs. So we had them rank different factors that they're considering, when they're sitting down at the kitchen table and there's a conservation organization, someone from a conservation organization across the table from them, what's kind of going through their mind and what are they thinking about, that kind of thing. What we found is that the actual restrictions in the programs were ranked the highest. So that's like, different limitations that participating in the program will have for their farming or ranching operation. That's kind of top of mind for a lot of people. The second, or the kind of the middle level important, was the level of trust they had in the organization. So, who's actually sitting across from them and who's actually delivering the message is a pretty big deal for the farming and ranching community. They have different trust, different perceptions of different organizations. Those kind of play a role in deciding who's going to participate in what. And the last one was the amount of funding. So of those three, the funding was the least important, which is kind of interesting, right? That's not to say the funding isn't important. Like having the funding there, I think, is still really important in a lot of cases, but it's not going to be funding, and it's not in and of itself that kind of gets a lot of people to sign up in a lot of cases. There's probably these other things that they're thinking about that take precedent. Yeah, so I think this is just the data that's showing how it broke down based on the ranks. So yeah, one thing when you're looking at ranked data, one thing you always want to look at in kind of a descriptive sense is like, is the thing that was ranked most important, which in this case was the restrictions, also the least important, just to see if there's consistency across that. But yeah, as you can see, it follows pretty good. Funding is the least important. It's ranked the most important the least amount of times, and the least important the most amount of times. Kind of thing. I think maybe one more. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so in terms of the instruments in order of preference, the conservation management agreements came out sort of top, followed by market certification, as well as conservation easements and land securement. And if you think back to the original diagram, like one of the things we were using these kind of preference rankings for is to get a sense of community values a little bit, right? And when you look at this, like it's a bit of kind of like analysis afterwards, but conservation management agreements and market certification, those two things both really support landowners having agency, just autonomy over their lands, right? And some of that's really important. They're not really given up a lot when they participate in either of these. For conservation management agreements, there may be some things that they have to give up, right? But you know, they're kind of negotiated, and they're not. As they have a role in kind of determining what those things are. When you think about easements and land securement, easements, you know, you still own your land, so you can still earn a living off it, but it does kind of constrain your options, right? So it kind of takes away a little bit of your autonomy over your land, right? Based on kind of what you've been used to and that kind of thing. A lot of conversations I have with people about easements, they talk about, it's not necessarily them, like they know they're not going to break the land, but they're worried about their kids and their grandkids, and they just want to, you know, kind of constrain that path for future generations, right? So that's kind of one thing that we're thinking about with easements. And land securement, selling the land, that's not palatable for a lot of people. They want to be out there, they kind of want to have that role, right? Some people obviously kind of fits with their strategy, their retirement strategy or something like that. They might sell the land, but in a lot of cases, you know, kind of you're kind of giving up a piece of yourself, right? Sometimes when you sell your land, so it's gonna be a bigger deal. Yeah, again, this is just how the data breaks down. You can kind of see conservation management agreements, the blue bar over there, 60% ranked most preferred versus only 4% ranked at least preferred, right? So it's a pretty strong signal there. That's what people want. Some of the other ones, certification, you know, a little bit lower. There's a little bit more, I would say, a little bit of uncertainty around certification a little bit, but it does come out kind of clearly as number 2, right? Easements are kind of a clear number 3. And securements are clear number 4. Kind of looks preferred. So there's 5. Yeah. So in terms of the incentive schemes that people were interested in, annual payments, cost sharing were first and second, followed by market premiums. Legal assurances were came in 4th, which is kind of interesting. And you know, the one-time payments were 5th. I would just say, you know, it kind of makes sense, annual payments being number 1. People are really thinking about their livelihoods, as annual payments kind of help with livelihoods, right? So that one makes sense. Cost sharing as well. A lot of people like cost sharing programs, that kind of thing. Market premiums in the middle, like I'd say it kind of reflects where I think a lot of people are skeptical there would ever be premiums, right? So, you know, that's kind of where they're at. So it makes sense that one's 3rd. When we were doing this work, we actually thought legal assurances would be a lot higher. And that was because people are concerned about restrictions, right? And kind of, you know, we do that. It is kind of interesting that legal assurances are so low, but part of that might actually be that there isn't a functioning program right now in Canada. There's kind of a couple individual landowners that are working on similar things. And in Canada, we have so we have the Species at Risk Act, which has what they call Section 11 agreements, which would be kind of similar to the Safe Harbor, right? They're kind of negotiating those in certain cases, but there's nothing that's out there functioning that, you know, they can show people, kind of get people on board, right? So it's a little bit, this may be part of the reason why it's ranked a little bit lower. And one-time payments were the least preferred by folks. Yeah, and again, this kind of shows the distribution of the data, that kind of stuff. You'll see like, you know, annual payments are clear, kind of number 1, that kind of stuff. Close to, you know, it's the cost based and the annual payments are sort of like they're very close, that kind of thing. The assurances or the premiums, you know, they're kind of equally in all categories, right? People are kind of undecided, not a lot of support either way. But yeah, the assurances, that's where the assurances and then the one-time payments, they're pretty close as well, which is actually the least. Right? It's I don't know, it's kind of interesting. Yeah, and so the other part that I was working on, whenever I show this to ranchers, they call this my spaghetti diagram. It's just like a bunch of lines. But the other part that I wanted to show with some of this work is it's not just about these individual instruments and incentives kind of working independently, but it's more about how you craft this sort of set of instruments and incentives to actually advance this, given that people have different preferences, right? So if you want to keep the most people happy, it'd be nice if kind of had this broad range of options for them. So what this is showing is, so the instruments are the red circles, the size kind of is related to how many people were ranked number 1, that kind of thing. And the purple or the blue boxes are the incentives. Again, it's size according to how many people were ranked them first. And what the lines are showing and the weight of the line shows the percentage of times that someone, for example, had CMAs ranked number 1 with annual payments ranked number 1. So you kind of get a sense of like how it's all coming together. So yeah, just some of the darker lines, you know, that one that I mentioned, that's the darkest one. A lot of people that like CMAs, like annual payments, that kind of thing. But it's interesting, like conservation management agreements are actually paired with a lot of different incentives, I guess. You know, the cost share comes up pretty strong, but even market premiums come up pretty strong. And, you know, at the time, Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef was developing, you know, different sort of mechanisms where, you know, some of what they were doing here could actually, you know, make it so that basically if you can have conservation management agreements that help you meet those sort of standards and obtain some of those market premiums, right? There's kind of like tying them together a little bit in that sense. I would just note even insurances kind of played a role in there potentially. And those are some of the decisions people are trying to make is like, if you're participating in these conservation management agreements, do you obtain like legal protected status for your land and stuff like that? Are we reporting it to the CBD? Are you sort of like potentially not subject to future environmental protection orders, which is like a really top-down mechanism, you know, stuff like that. So those kind of things were top of mind at the time when we were doing some of this research. But yeah, I don't know, other things to kind of notice. Certification was interesting. So even people that preferred certification, they noted market premiums a lot of times, but they're also kind of interested in annual payments and maybe even cost share, right? So it's, you know, sometimes the incentives could be a lot broader than you think for some of these programs. And the way that you would actually craft this, you know, we didn't get into that so much, like some of that would get kind of complicated, right? But this is kind of showing at least where people's preferences were for these different things. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit, you know, the bottom part of that social ecological fit diagram is the outcomes, right? We didn't have good data on like the actual conservation outcomes, but we want to kind of show some of the potential outcomes that we were able to measure in sort of a very kind of rough sense initially from some of this work. And I'll just say quickly, focus kind of on that idea of impacts, like how is it changing things, but also the idea of additionality, which is kind of a complicated thing to wrap your head around sometimes. But so one of the questions we asked is, to what extent do you think your engagement with programs has influenced your practices? That's like, how much is it actually kind of changing what you're doing? And you click that once more. What it's showing is that only 20% of people said it had no influence, and 80% of people were kind of split between having some influence or strong influence. You know, so 26% said strong, 54% said some. You know, this is kind of like a really rough way of measuring it, but it does kind of give you a sense of how people are seeing it influencing their own practices, right? And the majority of people are saying that it does influence them in some way, right? Which is kind of a good thing for the different programs. Oh, yeah, then these are just some qualitative open-ended responses, just to give you a sense of the types of things that people were talking about. So, you know, this example from Saskatchewan, they created more green space for native species, deferred harvest to allow birds nets. It's probably like a hay field or something like that, kind of delaying their cuts so that they're not trampling the nests, that kind of thing. Planted shelter belts, windbreaks, you know, just that kind of stuff that they probably wouldn't have done otherwise with the programs, right? This one's kind of showing kind of an interesting element of it, which I'll get into a little bit more in a minute. But one of the things so if you're kind of a farmer or rancher, you're out there making these daily decisions on your landscape. You don't necessarily have a written down plan all the time. Some people do, but a lot of people don't, right? It's not like an annual plan that they would necessarily produce. They're kind of out there, kind of top of mind. A lot of times before, they would just be thinking about livelihoods and how do I kind of maximize profits, right? But you know, what some people are saying is that through some of the learnings on the programs, they're actually start thinking more about species at risk when they're making those decisions. And you know, it's not necessarily that they're always making decisions in favor of species at risk, but at least they're kind of on the table now when they're kind of thinking about things. So that's kind of an interesting change. And the last one here is they just became kind of more aware of the species that are out there, which you guys kind of made that previous point, right? Kind of an important part for spreading conservation on these landscapes. And these are kind of some examples from Alberta. Again, the awareness kind of comes up. This one again kind of highlights the importance of that trust with different groups. Kind of shows us how important that can be. And I think this last point is important too, but also, not necessarily being totally top down, but listening to the producer's point of view on the development. So this kind of gets at that co-design, co-development aspect. Yeah, and this is kind of an interesting one where, it shows that people are working with biologists to actually make decisions on their property, which is also cool. So another question that we asked is, to what extent do you think your engagement with programs has changed the way that you view the environmental value of your farm or ranch? So that's again kind of related to that cognitive piece where it's like, how much do you actually think this is just your land for production versus how much do you see its kind of role in a broader ecosystem, right? And again, it's a slightly lower, but slightly lower percentage of people that sort of suggested there was a change, but 28% of people that said this hasn't changed that at all versus about 72% combined across some and large that said that they have kind of changed their perspective on the environmental value of their land. So it kind of shows that piece a little bit as well. Coming back to the whole idea of additionality, that's one thing. Is everybody kind of familiar with the concept of additionality? You've probably heard about it before, but essentially what it means is, so when you're doing a conservation program and there's payments from government or something like that, you want those payments to be going into something additional, right? So you don't want, so if somebody's already doing rotational grazing or something like that, if you want to make sure that somebody that's already doing it wouldn't be eligible. You want to do it, you want to pay somebody that wasn't doing it already, right? It's kind of the idea of additionality. It's important. It's obviously kind of shows an efficient use of government funding. But what happens sometimes is it actually leaves out some of the local leaders that are doing this stuff from the programs, right? And they start to feel excluded and that kind of thing. So if you're doing rotational grazing, you might not be eligible for that program, but through participation in some of these programs, what's showing is it does kind of change your mindset potentially. And so before you're doing a rotational grazing strictly for production, now you're doing it and you're thinking about species at risk a little bit more, right? So what we're trying to do with some of this is start to make those connections to additionality a little more. It's like a pretty heated debate among some of the communities at the time that we were talking to, right? So trying to show some of that stuff. Yeah, these are just some examples from Saskatchewan. Maybe one quick one more time. Yeah, people just kind of seeing, talking about how excited they are when they see the species at risk. Oh, sorry, I should explain. Sorry, species at risk, or endangered species, flourishing on their farms versus this is kind of interesting when it gets at that point I was making where they actually feel validated in some cases, right? They're out there trying to do stuff for birds or something like that, but they didn't really know. So the program kind of helps and validates them, gives them a little bit more knowledge and learning. They feel a little bit more confident in doing that. Yeah, and these are some examples from Alberta, just showing just how an increase in awareness of the impact their decisions are having on some of the other species and whatnot on their landscapes, and an increased willingness to kind of work with nature to have a bigger, kind of allowing nature to have a bigger share of the landscape, right? It's also kind of an important part. I would just mention, so we did this work kind of right before the pandemic. Lots of plans of kind of doing stuff that kind of was on hold for years. We're just kind of at the point now where we're working on new projects to actually go out and as I mentioned, it's kind of a convenient sample, more exploratory, right? We're kind of working now to do more sort of like hypothesis-driven work, kind of build on this a little bit, developing more of a random sample of producers, that kind of thing. Yeah, that's kind of some of the general insights, and I think it's time for questions and whatnot. So. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
So how much do the programs vary from province to province? Because you mentioned you're doing research in multiple. Does that matter, or is there a lot of similarities?
So yeah, so there are similarities. The way it works in Canada, provinces are very distinct, and the provinces are actually ones that have technically probably almost more jurisdiction than the federal government to do a lot of these things. So the provinces kind of put their own flavor on the programs, but a lot of it still is driven by federal funding and whatnot. So the federal government's kind of also influencing the program. So, when you think about cost share programs, there's cost share programs in all the provinces, but the way that they work would be a little bit different by province, right? What's kind of eligible and what's not. So they are somewhat distinct. Yeah.
Just to clarify, were there any specific programs that you guys initiated, or you were just gathering feedback on programs they were already a part of?
It was broad. But there was some initiation. So prior, some of this work was part of like, it's called SARPAL, Species Partnerships in Agricultural Landscapes, which was trying to do some experimental stuff. So that's where some of the results-based agreements came in, which is a little bit experimental, right? So there was some initiation of the projects as part of the broader program that I was a part of. But a lot of them were, the cost shares have been there for a long time and stuff like that in different forms, right? But, yeah. Yep.
I'm just curious about how you designed the diagram or the graphic. Is that like a program or did you create the, the interlocking, like the relationships between incentives?
Yeah.
Spaghetti one.
Yeah, like,
Yeah, so that's just a network analysis.
Okay.
really. So the way to do this, you do a matrix of, so it's like a bipartite graph, which is just like, there's a different number of rows and columns. So you have, some way to have the instruments on as the rows and the incentives as the columns. And then what you fill the matrix in is the weights of the lines. So the percentage of, the percentage of people that had CMAs and annual payments is another one, would be the weights. And then you add these are attributes of the nodes. And program I used for this, I think was either R, Gephi, or UCINet. So it's one of those three. But any of them kind of do it. There's lots of them, but it's just kind of a network analysis. Yeah.
I see we have a couple questions on chat. Do you want to?
Yeah, there is a question on Zoom from Wes Eaton. He said he arrived late, but he'd love to know when data collection happened during the project, like what point in time. And he said then added the social science data collection on perceptions.
Yeah, so so for the first part, it was the program, so the StarPal program, which is providing the funding, it was a 5-year program. This kind of happened at the end of year 4. So it's kind of like right before the last year. And what was the second part of that question?
He just added that when the social science data collection on perceptions happened.
Yeah, so it's kind of near the end. We were doing though throughout, like I'm presenting just on the surveys we were doing, but we were also doing interviews with people kind of throughout. More so the people that were specifically signed up about their perceptions of how things were going, right? And we used some of that to inform the survey. Yes. Is there a specific year? I think it's the end of 2020. Yeah, so we did this and then pre-pandemic. Yeah, like just pre.
It's kind of the atmosphere for conservation work amongst like Canadian landowners. Is it like, are people pretty pro-conservation or is it just farm by farm dependent?
That's a good question. So I'd say like within specifically the ranching community, especially the cow-calf operators, they're pretty pro-conservation even if they don't know it sometimes, right? They wouldn't, that kind of thing. It differs though. And so like part of the precursor to this work, so I mentioned, species at risk act, environmental protection orders. So just the reason there was a SARPAL program was because just prior there's an environmental protection order put on sage grouse, kind of the southwest part of Saskatchewan, which really upset everybody, as you can imagine, right? But what it did, people kind of got upset. But they were able to kind of redirect some of that whatever passion towards actually creating some of these local organizations and grassroots that then argued for programs like this and kind of got it out there more. So I'd say part of it is like, part of what people want to do with conservation is actually showcase what they're doing, right? And whatnot. I would say like that's kind of probably the broader kind of picture of the community, but it does come down to being kind of farm by farm in some cases, well, or ranch by ranch, right? It's pretty complex. These communities aren't homogenous in any sense, right? But some of the main industry associations and whatnot are definitely supportive of these things, right? So it's kind of becoming more and more ingrained, I would say. Yeah.
With the outcomes, is there any sort of reverse or not looking at how the farmers' attitudes have changed, but maybe how programs are approaching farmers, knowing what their priorities are, if it's different, has that affected any of the policy, or do you think it might?
So like anecdotally, I would say that it's grown a lot, right? So from like whenever that was 2012-ish, when they put on it, like the federal government put environmental protection on, no consultations before it, that kind of thing. I've kind of observed like people working in those organizations, institutions are a lot more kind of willing to listen to landowners now. It's kind of coming. There's always examples where they don't go. Like I don't know that there's a recent fertilizer kind of announcement, which is again kind of very top down, and the federal government kind of backs away on it. But at least people working on species at risk stuff specifically have really kind of bought into this idea like, yeah, we need to kind of co-design these things, make sure they work for people, and it's coming. But broadly across everything related to the environment and the federal government, you know, there's still kind of like really top-down initiatives that don't acknowledge the good things people are already doing, right? Kind of assume everybody's a criminal out there, right? Which doesn't bode very well. But
Kind of follow up on that, Jeremy. Some of the work we've done here in Wyoming in the West, a lot of the things that we hear often is that a lot of the ranchers or landowners feel like they are doing good practices, that they are good stewards of the land. And they feel like there's a perception among, say, urbanites, non-agriculturalists, that there's like ranchers are this like anti-wildlife, anti-environment sort of constituency. And so oftentimes for them, you know, they don't necessarily need a formal program, but what they want is more of like a recognition of what they're doing. Did that come across? Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of idea of recognition is important on this, right? And a lot of people like you know, I mentioned those people that kind of get left out on the additionality kind of clauses or whatever. A lot of them, they would still do it without the program. They don't really mind. It's more that like when the public, or like the government, which represents the public, says like, we're going to pay you to do this, even though you've been doing it for 50 years, you know, kind of leaves a bad taste in their mouth. And that's kind of when they actually start to want more a little bit, I would say, right? But
yeah, I think on that line of thought, pushing that a little further, one thing we know is when people are intrinsically motivated to adopt the pro-social behavior, if you start paying them, sometimes that warm glow they received otherwise gets crushed, right? So do you have a sense of it, whether it would be more harm than good if you started to pay these people rather than the neglect they feel?
like, again, it's not based on a huge sample of people, but you know, I can say like some of the people that receive payments are still kind of doing what they're doing. Even if they get upset sometimes, sometimes they care more about making sure there's like habitat for Sprague's pipit or something like that on their land than they do about the slight that they feel from the public sometimes, right? So, you know, so far I'd say not, but that is definitely a risk, right? But yeah.
Does that tension sort of contribute to the trust or lack thereof that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, that's like most of it is like, how does the organization kind of frame landowners, right? And what's kind of their history working with landowners, right? It's kind of like a big part of how these organizations are viewed, I guess. But yeah.
So another trend that we see is environmental preferences tend to erode when times are bad. Right? So I think it's really interesting you're able to do this in 2019. Leading up to the financial crisis, everybody was, you know, top issue was climate change. 2009 comes around, climate change is like number 7 on the list. Nobody cares. So I'm wondering if you were to redo this, you know, following the pandemic, since people have other things on their minds, do you think you'd find different results?
I think I would totally find different results because of the pandemic, but also, and I was kind of telling Drew and Travis this before too, but there's also been kind of a shift from like the policy framework. Like when I was doing this, it was really geared towards species at risk and biodiversity. Whereas like now it's way more about carbon. And this is kind of there, but it's like kind of in the background a little bit muted, right? And it's the same kind of practices you'd want to do in a lot of cases, right? So like, you know, thinking about that, there's different kind of conservation ethic for Sprague's pivot and whatnot is a little bit different than thinking about carbon and climate change. So I think it would be a little bit different. We're kind of working on that now, right? That's kind of one of the things we want to look at is it different and how so and why and whatnot. I was also part of you know, I mentioned I was doing some interviews with this project. We were actually doing some interviews when we kind of like March, April 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, when everything was kind of like all over the place and very uncertain. We actually stopped doing the interviews because it was just too much for people to be thinking about that right now in terms of everything else that they were thinking about, right? These are all phone interviews and whatnot, like we were social distancing now, but it was kind of a very different context where people didn't want to, some people still did, but a lot of people didn't want to be thinking about this stuff at that point, right?
I have a question. So you were talking about Canada's developing like an equivalent of a safe harbor agreement.
Yeah.
Do you know from maybe looking at other literature that helped inform this, if you do have an established legal option, does it rise higher in the list once people know about it and they're more familiar with it?
I'm not sure. Yeah, that's kind of our hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, kind of working on developed that hypothesis from conversation I had with some ranchers, right? That are really interested in that. There's like they're surprised that their peers don't care more about it too, right? That's kind of the general. I don't know if that actually has been shown to happen anywhere, but like here in the US, that kind of thing happen with the safe harbor.
I don't know that anyone's ever like, I don't know. There may be surveys out there. I'm not aware of them, but yeah, it'd be interesting to know.
Yep.
How a legal instrument ranks against more of like a.
And it's weird because like when you're interviewing somebody, it seems like the legal assurances would be exactly what they want. They want some kind of shelter from these things, right? But then in the survey, they break that kind of low, right? So it's-
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Yeah, I think Nita has a question.
Hi, thank you, Wes. Sorry, Jeremy. Enjoyed the presentation. I was curious, do you have a comparison with ranchers that have not engaged in any sort of any of these conservation mechanisms? Is there anything out there that says why they wouldn't join or prohibit their interest?
So some of it I think is, we did do a comparison of that. I didn't show it here today, but we did kind of compare some of that in the data. Some of it comes down to who's approaching them, that trust in the organization piece. But you kind of related to that as the whole idea, like not all those options are always on the table for people, right? So they're maybe approached with land securement or easements, maybe more interested in some of the other things, right? So that's one of the other things too, is it's some cases it's hard to do that because not everybody has had the same exposure to the programs, right? So like the programs, like they kind of have a certain capacity, they're able to reach a certain number of producers, right? So in some cases, like not everybody has had that same kind of exposure and experience and whatnot, kind of working on these things. So it's kind of hard to compare the people that have been in with people that haven't, but that's kind of some general stuff that we were finding. It comes down a lot to like who's approaching them and that kind of thing.
So on your perceptions bar graphs that you had, where you were including the first two as somewhat favorable and very favorable, is there methodologically any concern with that middle category? People just kind of anchoring towards the middle because they don't like the question or they want to satisfy the experimenter or?
Yeah, so like there are, anytime you do like and that kind of thing, there's that kind of stuff, but one of the reasons, that's why I was kind of showing that overarching like that overarching percentage of the two. That's one reason I was thinking that's like from a methodological, like a measurement error kind of perspective. It's really hard to tell the difference between like strongly agree versus kind of agree, right? And so what I was trying to show is some of that, a couple more down. Go. One more. Yeah. Yeah. So you go here, like what I was trying to show based on the wording of the question. You know, basically like if you really didn't think there was any influence, you'd be clicking there. If you think there was some influence, you kind of put it there. But we don't really know what's the difference between strong and some, right? It's difficult to interpret, but so we want to see like if they perceive any influence, it kind of falls over there. That's kind of how I did it here. It's not the perfect way of measuring this. This is very kind of first attempt to do it. You know what I mean? But yeah, that'd be the one kind of methodological issue when you come up with something like this. In terms of anchoring to the middle, that's possible. We didn't look at like one thing we could look at to kind of get a sense of that is like how long they spent on the question, you know, but they're not just kind of clicking through. Haven't done that yet. But that's something that we could look at, I guess.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there another one in the chat? No. Okay, well, we're actually a little bit over time, so thank you so much for joining us. You all here next week, same time for a guest lecture by Wes Martell from the Wind River.